She was tied to a pole right at the reception and called a disgrace to the family, but a minute later her husband showed up and everyone went pale. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments what country you're from. From the outside, the Kinsley estate looked like the portrait of American aristocracy. 3 acres of sculpted hedges, a circular drive lined with imported Italian stone, and a house that towered in clean white symmetry like a courthouse wrapped in pearls. People passing by would slow their cars just to get a longer glimpse of the place. It appeared in charity brochures and local magazines, always with phrases like pillar of the community or beacon of grace. But for Aaliyah, the girl they raised behind those pillars, it had never been anything more than a gilded cage. She had lived there since she was 5 years old. The first memory she had of the house wasn't the marble foyer or the tall French doors. It was the silence. Not the kind of silence filled with warmth or safety, but the kind that wrapped around her like a verdict, wordless but heavy, that told her she did not belong. The Kinsleys didn't beat her. They didn't scream. They didn't lock her away. Instead, they suffocated her in expectation and cold civility, in the quiet horror of polite exclusion. She had been adopted under the pretense of charity after a car crash took her biological mother, a brilliant pianist and college senior who had raised Aaliyah alone. Her father was listed as unknown on every document, and the adoption was arranged through a local church's outreach program for at-risk children. The Kinsleys, already under scrutiny after Judge Kinsley made a racially charged comment on record, found a way to soften their public image with a very specific kind of redemption. Adopting a black girl from a tragic background became their absolution. They named her Aaliyah Kinsley, placed her in their home, gave her a bed with a white canopy and a closet full of pre-approved dresses. But they never gave her a place at the table. Not really. She was spoken of with patronizing pride, our adopted daughter, as if her presence was a trophy, a symbol of moral elevation. Not once did they allow her to call them Mom or Dad. When she tried, they gently corrected her over and over until she learned to keep her tongue still. Her childhood was a collection of contradictions. She had access to the best schools, but was forbidden from joining the debate team because your voice doesn't carry the right authority. She was praised for good grades in private, but never acknowledged publicly. At family galas, she was made to stand 2 steps behind her siblings. On holiday cards, she was either cropped out or made to wear colors that helped her blend. Her hair was chemically straightened every month, her skin compared to coffee and chocolate and jokes no one else found funny. By the time she turned 16, she had stopped asking why. The Kinsley siblings, Julian and Meredith, grew into polished versions of their parents. Julian was a rising attorney, cold and mechanical, always dressed in blues and grays as if color itself was beneath him. Meredith, 2 years younger than Aaliyah, was a magazine-featured columnist and social media darling. She wore pastel dresses and studied how to tilt her head in photos. She referred to Aaliyah as the family's social experiment, in whispered conversations that weren't as quiet as she thought. They all shared one belief. Aaliyah should be grateful. Grateful for the roof, the clothes, the education, the surname. Grateful enough to be silent, compliant, and invisible. Aaliyah's adulthood unfolded like a quiet rebellion. She didn't shout, she didn't storm out. Instead, she worked. She finished college through scholarships and work-study programs, while simultaneously managing the Kinsley family's neglected bookkeeping behind the scenes. When the nonprofit sector called her name, she answered. She founded a data platform for distributing microgrants to marginalized entrepreneurs. It succeeded quietly, like everything else she did. That's when she met Morgan Hart. It started at a tech conference in D.C. Two solitary figures at the coffee station, both exhausted by the forced networking and smiling faces. He was soft-spoken and sharp-eyed, a coder with a vision that no investor believed in. She saw in him something that mirrored her own reflection, someone overlooked, underestimated, but burning quietly with the hunger to build something honest. They fell into conversation that night, then emails, then weekend visits, then love. By the time Morgan's startup exploded, attracting national headlines and billion-dollar valuations, they were already bound by something deeper than contracts or capital. But they kept it private. Aaliyah knew her family would never accept him, not because he was wealthy, but because he was black, successful, and entirely outside their control. They married quietly in Seattle, witnessed by close friends and no family. She wore a simple dress, he wore the same watch he always did, and their vows were short but true. In the months that followed, Aaliyah's relationship with the Kinsleys grew stranger. Her financial support became necessary. Judge Kinsley had accrued serious debts, and Meredith's boutique media firm was bleeding money. Without revealing her identity, Aaliyah used her nonprofit's shell accounts to discreetly pay overdue taxes on the Kinsley estate. She cleared a second mortgage. She paid for Julian's law firm bailout through a donation to a legal foundation he didn't know she funded. She did it not for love, but for closure. Maybe, somewhere in her bones, she hoped that if she could just keep the structure standing, the people inside it would eventually become better. Maybe she could prove she was worth something. Maybe they'd finally see her. But the house never changed. Its walls still echoed with whispered insults and choreographed civility. They still forgot her birthday. They still corrected her tone, her posture, her ambition. She was still too much and never enough. The breaking point came on a hot July morning. She had just returned from a site visit to a shelter renovation project and found an envelope on her bed. It was an invitation to a Kinsley Foundation Garden Gala, celebrating a legacy of giving. Her name wasn't on the event materials, but she had organized every logistical detail. She brought it up at dinner. Judge Kinsley glanced over his wine. "Why would your name be there? You're not a trustee." "But I created the partnerships. The fund exists because we allowed you to operate under our name," Meredith said sweetly, cutting her chicken. "That's a privilege, not a right." Aaliyah didn't respond. She stood, excused herself, and went back to her room. That night, she lay awake for hours. Morgan texted her, "Still want to go through with this?" She stared at the screen for a long time, then replied, "Yes, let them show their true faces." The gala was scheduled for the following weekend, an exclusive affair with catered cuisine, string quartets, and a guest list pulled from the governor's Rolodex. The Kinsleys rehearsed speeches. Meredith coordinated photographers. Julian reviewed legal disclaimers to ensure no unwanted stories would surface. Aaliyah was handed a beige server's uniform. Not a dress, not a name tag, just an outfit designed to match the tablecloths. She put it on, quietly. Morgan booked a flight. She waited. And the house, unaware of the storm approaching, glittered on the surface. Marble, music, champagne, and all. But underneath it, something old was breaking, something patient, something deep, and once it snapped, it would change everything. Aaliyah didn't sleep that night either, but this time she wasn't tired. She was ready. The morning of the gala dawned with heat already pressing against the windows, thick and suffocating like a warning. Aaliyah rose early, not because she had things to do, though she always did, but because sleep had evaded her entirely. She watched the sky lighten from indigo to pale gold through the slats of the blinds and sat silently on the edge of her bed, still in the server's uniform she'd been handed the day before. It lay across her lap like a costume from a play she no longer wished to be part of. Downstairs, the estate came alive with hurried steps and the soft hum of hired staff setting tables and arranging centerpieces. White tents were raised along the edge of the lawn, their corners flapping gently in the breeze. Crystal glasses sparkled in the sunlight. Rows of designer chairs framed a circular platform built beside the garden's fountain. There, guests would toast to a legacy of giving, unaware that the only reason the property still stood was the quiet intervention of the woman now being told to stay invisible. Aaliyah moved through the kitchen, ignored by everyone but the pastry chef, who gave her a curt nod and returned to arranging macarons. She found her assigned position on a chart pinned to the fridge. Station 4, wine service, rear patio. The chart didn't list names, only roles, just as the Kinsleys preferred. They never liked their help too visible. By early afternoon, the first guests began to arrive. Luxury sedans pulled up in sequence. Women in pastels and men in summer suits filtered through the gate, air-kissing, adjusting jewelry, laughing in the low, practiced tones of those accustomed to power. Aaliyah took her place near the edge of the patio, hands folded neatly, waiting for her signal. She saw Julian first, holding court near the entry with 2 city councilmen. He gestured with the ease of someone who'd grown up knowing the world would listen. Meredith followed, wearing an off-white gown with embroidered lilies and a delicate pearl headband that made her look like a bridal magazine cover. She carried a glass of champagne and wore a smile so polished it might have been carved. Their parents flanked them. The judge in a pale linen suit, his wife in a pale blue sheath dress, diamonds winking from her throat. There were speeches, toasts, photographers. Every word spoken from the stage was a careful performance. How the Kinsley family had served the community for generations, how they had opened their hearts and home to those in need, how their legacy was rooted in empathy and leadership. The audience applauded, sipped their drinks, and never once looked in Aaliyah's direction. She moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses, avoiding eye contact. A few guests mistook her for a caterer and murmured orders at her without even turning their heads. One man smiled at her and said, "Didn't expect the help to look so exotic tonight." She didn't respond. She'd spent years learning that her silence was their comfort. The sun began to lower, casting a golden glow across the property, softening its sharp edges. It was then, as Aaliyah was reaching for an empty flute, that she heard the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. A stemmed wine glass had slipped from a guest's hand, shattering on the flagstones. Aaliyah instinctively knelt to pick up the pieces. The woman, embarrassed, waved her off. "Don't worry, she's used to cleaning up after others," Meredith called from behind her, voice bright with mock sisterly affection. The laughter that followed was small, tight, and unmistakably cruel. Aaliyah stood slowly, glass slivers in her hand, blood beginning to bead at the corner of her palm. Her face remained still. She turned and walked toward the catering tent, ignoring the stares. Inside, she rinsed her hand under cold water and wrapped it in a paper towel. It was only a moment later that the real breaking point came. Back outside, the judge, perhaps emboldened by drink or by the laughter of the crowd, raised his hand for attention. He gestured for Aaliyah to come forward. "We'd like to do something symbolic," he announced with a smirk, a gesture of reflection on the history we all share, the burden others have carried for us. There was a pause, just long enough to let the suggestion settle. "What do you say, Aaliyah? Up for a little performance?" Before she could answer, two hired event assistants, young, unaware, obedient, took gentle hold of her arms. "We'll make it quick," one of them said, as though that mattered. They led her toward the fountain, where a wooden column stood, part of a decorative installation meant to mimic historic architecture. Aaliyah knew it had no purpose other than appearance, but now it had been repurposed as a stage of shame. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. They turned her toward the crowd, back to the column, and tied a length of silk rope around her wrists. Her bare arms gleamed in the dying light. Her dress, the beige server's uniform, hung limp and unflattering. She stood there, straight-backed and silent, as a murmur of amusement ran through the audience. Laughter flickered again, a few camera phones raised. Not in cruelty, they would claim later, but just for the moment. Meredith giggled, sipping her drink. Julian rolled his eyes and muttered something to a man beside him about always needing the last word. The judge raised his glass. "A reminder," he said, "of how far we've come." More laughter. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. She locked her gaze on the horizon. She felt the rope against her skin, smelled the sweat rising from her collarbone, tasted metal at the back of her tongue. Every part of her was pulsing with humiliation, but she would not let them see it. She had given them years. She had paid their bills, saved their legacy, and hidden her pain behind perfect posture and careful smiles. And in return, they gave her this: an exhibit, an object, a lesson to be paraded in front of the powerful. She waited. She didn't know the exact moment Morgan arrived, but she heard the engine, smooth, low, distinct. The guests turned. The laughter stuttered, then stopped. Forks paused mid-air. Glasses wavered. A black Rolls-Royce glided up the drive and came to a slow, deliberate halt near the garden's edge. Its presence alone silenced the space. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Morgan Harlan Hart emerged like a storm in human form, tall, deliberate, wrapped in a navy blue suit that looked tailored to his heartbeat. His face was unreadable. His movements were slow and clean. His eyes scanned the crowd like they were irrelevant details. And then they found her. Aaliyah, still tied, still barefoot, still silent. He walked without a word, through stunned onlookers, through whispers, through the hushed chaos of people realizing they were in the presence of someone far greater than they had imagined. He reached the fountain. She didn't move. He knelt, pulled a slim blade from the inside of his jacket and sliced through the silk. Her wrist came free. He took her hand gently, inspecting the raw skin, then brought it to his lips and kissed the wound. It was then that people truly began to understand. The judge took a step forward, lips parted. "Who?" Morgan's voice cut clean through the gathering. "This woman is my wife." A gasp, collective and real, spread through the air like fire over dry leaves. "I want to know who thought tying her to a post like an animal was acceptable." No one answered, not even Meredith, whose wineglass trembled in her hand, not even Julian, who took an instinctive half-step backward. Aaliyah said nothing. Morgan stood tall beside her. "This ends now," he said. "You have 15 minutes to gather your things and leave this property." The judge blinked. "Leave?" Morgan turned slightly. "You don't own it. Not anymore." He reached into his breast pocket and unfolded a document. 3 months ago, this house went into default. Unpaid taxes, missed mortgage deadlines, desperate calls to creditors, every one of them answered by her. He held up the deed. She paid for this house with her college savings, her emergency fund. She sold her car. She emptied her future trying to save your past. And when the bank finally issued notice, she called me. A beat. She didn't ask for help. She asked if I could buy it anonymously, so you wouldn't lose face. He handed the deed to the judge, whose hands shook as he unfolded it. Take a look. You signed it. Silence, thick and stretching. The crowd began to shift uneasily. Morgan turned toward them again. You didn't raise a failure, he said. You raised a woman who kept your lights on, who held this house together while you mocked her, and today, on the very soil she saved, you humiliated her. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply spoke the truth, and it landed heavier than any scream. And no one, absolutely no one, had the courage to argue. Aaliyah stood there, untied, but stronger than she had ever been. And the ones who thought they had broken her were already starting to scatter. There was a strange stillness in the air, the kind that followed an unexpected silence after too much noise. For a few seconds, the gala seemed frozen in place. Guests mid-turn, forks halfway to lips, glasses hanging from uncertain fingers. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows over the manicured lawn, as if time itself had paused to witness what came next. Morgan stood beside Aaliyah with the stillness of a man who did not need to raise his voice to command attention. His presence was like gravity, undeniable and quietly forceful. The navy suit he wore fit his body like a second skin, his hands steady as he handed the deed to the man who had called himself Aaliyah's father for over 2 decades. Judge Kinsley, once so imposing in courtrooms and campaign photos, now looked like a man crumbling under the weight of something he could neither dismiss nor deny. He unfolded the paper slowly, as though he hoped it might say something different each time he blinked. But there it was. His signature, his address, the official stamp of sale. Transferred to a holding company that he had assumed was a nameless investor. A lifeline in the midst of foreclosure. A favor, a miracle, a trap. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Beside him, his wife reached for the paper, scanning the text with growing alarm. Her mouth twitched with disbelief, and then she looked up wild-eyed, searching for something to cling to. You tricked us, she said, voice barely above a whisper. You tricked us. Aaliyah's voice finally broke through the tension, low and steady, her throat raw but firm. No, I saved you. She looked directly at her mother, the woman who had taught her how to sit straight but never how to stand tall. And you tied me to a pole. That sentence alone might have knocked the wind out of the room. No one dared speak. Even the guests who had chuckled moments ago now stood stiff and silent, their expressions twisting in discomfort, as if realizing too late that the performance they had laughed at had been someone else's crucifixion. Morgan took a step forward, not toward the judge or his wife, but toward the rest of the crowd. His gaze moved from face to face, calm and deliberate. Let's make one thing clear, he said, his voice cool and quiet, but carrying like thunder on a still night. This woman gave up everything to protect people who never protected her. She poured her savings, her energy, her future into saving this house, not for recognition, not for thanks, but because she thought maybe, just maybe, family meant something. He let the words settle, then continued. When the foreclosure notice came, she didn't come to me in desperation. She came with a plan. She asked me to buy the house without using my name. It wasn't the cold, performative quiet of resentment and decorum. It was something warmer, fuller, something that allowed breath to move freely through the lungs without fear of consequence. Aaliyah stood at the threshold of the back patio, her hand still gently entwined with Morgan's, the remnants of the evening, folded chairs, half-filled glasses, forgotten shawls, strewn like discarded pieces of an old play no one wanted to perform again. The fountain, once the centerpiece of the family's precious garden, still murmured softly, its water sparkling in the low lights that flickered against the twilight sky. The wooden column she had been tied to stood crooked now, its silk rope coiled loosely at its base, looking strangely ordinary without the spectacle. Morgan moved toward it without a word. He bent down, picked up the rope, examined it for a moment, then carried it to the trash bin near the gate and dropped it in. There was no ceremony, no anger in his movement, only quiet finality. Aaliyah watched him, her arms crossed lightly over her chest, not in defense, but in contemplation. She had imagined this moment once before, but never like this. She had thought freedom would feel loud and triumphant, that vindication would come with applause or some cathartic scream. But what she felt instead was stillness. Not the stillness of being ignored or pushed aside, but the kind that follows the end of a long, brutal storm. A pause to breathe. A moment to just exist. Morgan returned to her side and placed a hand gently on her lower back. You could sell this place, he said after a pause. We could go anywhere. Paris, Seattle, buy land in Vermont and build something from scratch. She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth lifting with something close to real amusement. You know I hate snow. He chuckled softly, leaning into her shoulder. Then forget Vermont. They sat together on the stone bench beneath the patio pergola, bathed in the golden leftovers of the sunset. Aaliyah tilted her head toward the sky, the warmth on her skin feeling different now, less like something she had to endure and more like something she could savor. For the first time in years, she wasn't bracing for an insult. She wasn't calculating how to speak, where to sit, what tone to use to be taken seriously. She was just here, and she was allowed to be. Do you remember when we met? She asked suddenly, her voice quiet, reflective. Morgan nodded, a fond smile curling at his lips. Of course. You were working 2 jobs, finishing night school, still managing to file your father's taxes and make sure your mother took her meds. And you were living above a bookstore, she said, grinning now, trying to build a startup that no one believed in. You were the only one who did. She turned to look at him fully. I didn't see a billionaire when I met you, she said. I saw someone who listened, someone who looked me in the eye and didn't see an obligation. I saw someone who didn't ask me to be small. He took her hand again and held it gently between his own. Neither spoke for a while after that. The kind of silence that passed between them now was different than the silence she had known in that house for decades. This one didn't demand apology or restraint. It didn't wrap itself around her like a gag. It was soft and expansive, a room she could stretch out in without hidden walls. Eventually, she leaned her head on his shoulder. I want to start over, she said, so softly it was almost a breath. I want a life that feels like mine. Morgan nodded, brushing his thumb across the back of her hand. Say the word, and we'll build it from the ground up. No more chains, no more proving anything to anyone. They sat there until the sky turned indigo and the cicadas began to sing in the trees. When they finally stood, it wasn't with haste or exhaustion, but with purpose. They moved through the house like explorers in a newly discovered land. The rooms looked the same chandelier in the foyer, the same marble-topped counters, the same long dining table. But the energy had changed. It was no longer their stage. It was hers now. In the living room, she paused to examine the wine glasses still scattered on the tables. Napkins lay crumpled near the fireplace, and dessert plates balanced on the edges of furniture like relics of a family that had never truly existed. She walked over and lifted one of the framed photographs from the mantel. It was an old family portrait. Her siblings in tailored outfits, her mother in soft pastels, the judge in a commanding stance, and Aaliyah, stiff and slightly off-center, smiling too hard in a dress chosen for her by someone else. "Keep it?" Morgan asked from behind her. She looked at the photo for another moment, then turned it face down and placed it on the table. "No, that's not who I am anymore." The following morning, Aaliyah woke with the windows open and the scent of rain-soaked grass drifting in. She lay in bed for a while, listening to the birds, her hand resting on her chest, marveling at the absence of tension. She no longer woke up waiting for the next command, the next cold glance, the next unspoken insult. In the kitchen, Morgan had already brewed coffee. He handed her a cup without a word, as if they'd always lived this way. She leaned against the counter and watched him hum tunelessly while he scrambled eggs. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was whole. That week, they began clearing out the house. She didn't cry once. There was no mourning left in her, just clarity. They boxed her parents' things, the vintage crystal, the old legal journals, Meredith's trophies, and placed them in storage. Not out of sentiment, but because the past no longer had the power to wound her. In the attic, they found her old notebooks dusty and tucked behind holiday decorations. She flipped one open and found a list titled, "Things I'll Do When I'm Free." It was written in the green pen, the handwriting a little crooked. Morgan leaned over her shoulder and read it silently. "Learn to paint a sunset," he read aloud, a smile growing on his face. "I didn't say they were big dreams," she said with a laugh. "Just mine." "Then let's go buy you some paints." They turned the old study into an art room. Morgan built shelves. She filled them with brushes, canvases, jars of color she hadn't let herself touch in years. The first thing she painted wasn't a sunset. It was the view from the back patio, with the column gone, the garden peaceful, the sky open. They started having dinners at the long oak table that had once been the site of cold glances and biting remarks. Now it held candles, bread, soft music, and conversations that never turned cruel. They laughed, not because everything was perfect, but because it was finally real. One night, Morgan came home and placed a small key in her hand. "I bought a cabin," he said. "Lake view, no neighbors, just trees, stars, and us, for when this place feels too heavy." She looked at the key for a long time. "You're not trying to run away from this, are you?" "No," he said gently. "I just want you to know you have choices now, not chains." That night, she stood on the back porch and stared out at the yard. It no longer looked like the scene of a crime. It looked like soil, and for the first time she saw it not as the place she had survived, but as the ground on which she could begin. A few months later, a letter arrived in the mail. An invitation to Meredith's engagement party. Her name was misspelled. The envelope was addressed to Miss A. Kingsley. Morgan opened it, raised an eyebrow, and handed it to her without a word. She smiled. "I'm not going." He tilted his head. Then what? She walked to her desk, pulled out a photo, the one of her and Morgan at the Global Innovation Conference, arms around each other, both grinning as he accepted the award. She signed the back with a silver pen. From the useless girl you raised, thank you for setting me free. She slipped it into the envelope, sealed it, and sent it off without a second thought. Now, when she wakes in the morning, she waters her plants, paints in sunlight, walks barefoot on the cool kitchen tile while Morgan sings off-key in the next room. She makes coffee without urgency. She breathes without waiting for the air to turn cruel. Her life isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. Because the girl who once stood tied to a post, praying to disappear, no longer lives in that house. In her place stands a woman with her hands covered in paint, her chest full of breath, and a future that finally belongs to her. And if Aaliyah could whisper one thing to that girl in the garden, to that trembling heart with wrists bound and pride cracked open, it would be this: hold on. You're not finished. Your best chapter hasn't even begun. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories like this one, and share this video with someone who needs to see it.